August the 12th, President Wilson returned to Washington from his wife's funeral with notes for a speech that he delivered to Congress a week later. He declared that America's response to this madness would be neutrality. As the rest of the world's powers took up arms, America would work for peace.
Wilson saw the United States as a city on the hill, a virtuous nation standing apart, whose role, as he soon came to believe, was to be primarily as a mediator.
President Wilson told the nation this was America's opportunity to gain great permanent glory. But King and Kaiser considered Wilson irrelevant. Their soldiers thought him a starry-eyed idealist. By early 1915, the war in Europe was good for America. U.S. banks were lending huge amounts of money to Britain and France, who in turn used the money to buy arms from American factories. With the war, Americans were in the greatest economic boom in their history.
During the war, everybody worked. Before the war, my father brought home $6 or $7 a week. Now he brought home checks for $100, $110 a week. It was like bringing home a check for $1 million.
The war had another effect. It virtually cut off European immigration to the United States, causing a labor shortage in American factories. And that forced northern employers to look for the very first time at the substantial black labor pool of the American South.
Black news, the movie house.
As movie-making techniques improved, movies became an American obsession. And it was in the movie houses that Americans were exposed to the war in Europe. In the movie house, it still seemed glamorous.
We went every Saturday morning and just devoured the pictures of the war. Beautiful uniforms of the dashing mounted cavalry with their flashing sabers in the sun riding into battle, and oh, I thought that would be something else. I was just aching to go.
The movies were the perfect proving ground for the new art form called propaganda. Americans saw and soon sympathized with the British view of the Germans. In New York City on May the 1st, 1915, 1,900 people boarded the luxury liner the Lusitania at Pier 54. The pride of the British Cunard Line was setting sail for England.
She was simply a wonderful, steady ship. She had 4 red funnels, and she was a beautiful sight to see. She really was.
Edith Stanley and her family were going home. The First World War was almost a year old, and any transatlantic crossing was made potentially dangerous by the presence of German submarines. But the passengers felt safe. No one would dare sink a passenger ship. Still, the German embassy had put a notice in the New York Times that very morning which said, "Travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." The captain told a reporter that the warning was the best joke he'd heard in years. After 6 uneventful days at sea, on a beautiful sunny afternoon, May the 7th, the Lusitania was passing safely by the Irish coast.
It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You could see all this coastline, and then bang! Dad knew what it was. I mean, that he knew darn well it was a torpedo.
The German torpedo did such damage to the Lusitania that she sank in 18 minutes. Only 6 of her lifeboats were launched.
But we could not take the people in that were begging to be taken in. I mean, we would have capsized and everybody would have gone. 1,200 drowned, didn't they? I think it was 1,200 drowned. More drowned than were saved.
including 128 Americans.
The Lusitania, that's only 3 years after the Titanic. One writer said, now it's the act of man, not the act of God, that has done this.
The British and the French hoped that this outrage would bring the Americans into the war on their side. But that night, President Wilson refused even to hear the details of the sinking, fearing that he would react too strongly and lose control. President Wilson agonized at his typewriter for 3 days. On the third day, he finally typed out not a declaration of war, but a strongly worded note of protest to the Kaiser.
The Kaiser reacted with, as he always did, with a blend of defiance and concern. He would sort of wave his good fist in the air and saying, no man tells me what to do. This little Wilson is only a college professor. Who cares about him? And the next he would say, there are a lot of those Americans over there, and they have a lot of industrial capacity. We'd better be careful.
When the Germans sank another British liner with the loss of 2 more American lives, the president protested again. This time he threatened to break diplomatic relations with Germany. On September the 1st, Wilson got what he wanted, a pledge from the Germans that they would call off their submarines. The British and the French were angry that Wilson refused to enter the war. On the Western Front, the British troops had come up with a joke. They called the shells that wouldn't explode, the duds, Wilsons. By the new year in 1916, over a year into the war, there was no movement whatsoever along the Western Front. The generals of both armies had resorted to a most primitive form of warfare, throwing men